Hello and welcome to all the attendees to today's session, Driving Security into Your Business, How to Leverage Zero Trust to Address FWA by speaker John Kapczynski, Director of Information Security Transformation, Freddie Mac. I am Seema Singh and I will be your host for the day. Please note the session will be in listen-only mode and will last for 40 minutes, out of which the last 10 will be dedicated to the Q&A, requesting all the participants to post questions in the Q&A window. Should you need any assistance during the session, please use the chat box. Also, if you face any audio-video challenges, please check your internet connections or you may log out and log in again. A very important announcement for the certificate of attendance. The participant need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. The participant should fill in the survey form in the attendee's thank you mail and answer the 3 questions based on the webinar, provided speaker with the right answer within the same day. If these 2 criteria are met, then only the participant will receive the certificate of attendance within 5 to 7 working days after the event. About our speaker, John leads the Freddie Mac's Information Security Transformation team to help execute the firm's cyber agenda and corporate cyber goals by building and improving internal processes and technology environments. Over the last 2 decades, John has built and improved information security organizations and aligned the cyber agenda towards evolving business and technology programs by providing greater visibility and understanding of changing risks. Additionally, he has helped many firms to understand how to align their cyber agenda with dynamic business and compliance priorities. So now, without any further delay, I would now hand over the session to you, John.
Thank you, Seema. I appreciate it. Again, my name is John Kapczynski. I'm a Director of Information Security Transformation here at Freddie Mac. I have 2 decades of information security experience, primarily within the areas of financial services, governance, consulting, mergers and acquisitions, and healthcare. Next slide, please. Over the course of these 2 decades, I've helped deliver over 100 projects and cyber capabilities, and I've seen trends emerge over the time. Everything from supply chain attacks to how to be able to move actionable intelligence through leveraging threat intel outside of the scene, moving from orchestration and moving towards orchestration and automated response, and obviously the evolving compliance mandates, including GDPR, CCPA, CMMC, and FFIEC, and also importantly, the reemergence and recalibration of ransomware attacks that we've seen within the news recently as well. I do need to state that obviously all the opinions here and viewpoints are my own and should not be attributed to that of my employer. This is also the first time that I'm giving this talk, and so obviously feedback and dialogue is welcome, of course, and so I appreciate that. What do I hope people get out of today's presentation? So again, we want to be able to define the problem. So what is fraud, waste, and abuse, and how big is that problem? So what's the scale, size, and scope of fraud, waste, and abuse within our area? What are the broad brush elements associated with zero trust? So we'll highlight zero trust using some metaphors, but also some technical examples to be able to highlight this approach and strategy. And then finally, how can zero trust be leveraged to be able to address fraud, waste, and abuse? One of the other things I want to be able to say is that this talk is about 30 to 35 minutes or so. We can easily spend a week talking through all the different salient points below, and so I'm going to try to go fairly quickly, but obviously if there are other questions or comments, and feel free to be able to link me in or to be able to have be able to start a dialogue offline as well. Next slide, please. So talking about why is it important to be able to have this conversation now? So as we can see from the Verizon DVIR report over here on the top left-hand side, financial crimes are on the rise and have continued to be on the rise. And so we've obviously seen fairly flat line with respect to other as well as espionage, but obviously financially motivated attacks are continuing to be able to increase. Obviously, within the last year, we've seen there's been a dramatic and seismic shift to remote working since March 2020 because of the pandemic, and because of that, obviously, organizations are more dependent upon technology now than ever before. So you can no longer go down the hallway to be able to tap your colleague on the shoulder. To be able to ask questions or to be able to interact, and so obviously we are tied and tethered to our technology and workstations in order to be able to complete work, so that our firms are able to continue to be able to be productive in this new normal. Obviously, there is a return to work that's happening now as organizations are moving back into the office, but for all intents and purposes, this is, the remote working environment is going to continue and persist for a while now. Additionally, fraud, waste, and abuse use cases traditionally reflects one of the lowest or no risk appetites within an organization. So to adequately manage fraud, waste, and abuse, a close alignment is required between prevention, detection, mitigation process, and a risk appetite that takes into consideration both external oversight, as well as the risk culture of an organization and alignment to risk accountability. So the 3 lines of defense: control effectiveness and risk transparency. So data, metrics, and reporting. So while there is some level of acceptance for financial loss, there is often zero risk appetite for reputational impact, or risk-facing regulatory or government inquiry as it relates to fraud, waste, and abuse. And so again, as we're looking at kind of that risk appetite to be able to define what exactly is fraud, waste, and abuse, and so there's little appetite for certain activities to be able to happen both externally and internally within an organization because of the reputational impact and also the regulatory. However, the lower appetite for fraud, risk, and losses tends to lead to a greater number of coverage of processes in place to be able to address kind of those high-risk areas. And so obviously, if the lower the risk appetite, the higher the controls need to be able to be on the other side to be able to make sure that proper coverage is being addressed from that appetite perspective. To this point, we've obviously seen a significant rise in the disruptive nature of attacks that have garnered worldwide attention, so none more significant than the recent rise in ransomware attacks. And so all these items on the right-hand corner are all news snippets that have come up within the last quarter. And so everything from the Colonial Pipeline, again targeting oil, the cost paid was $4.4 million in Bitcoin. Then we have Brentag, which is again chemical industry, cost $4.4 million in terms of the ransomware. Acer was also hit in May 2021. JBS Foods, Quanta, the National Basketball Association was also a target as well. AXA and CAN were also part of their insurance, large insurance providers, and so they were targeted. And the entertainment industry was targeted as well. So both EA as well as CD Projekt were also targeted in February 2021, and also EA recently as well. And so the entertainment industry is is also susceptible to these types of attacks. Kia Motors, so from the automotive perspective, are also targeted, was also targeted back in February. And so again, these are front page of the Washington Post, front page of the New York Times, front page of international media in terms of activities that have happened that all reflect obviously reputational and reputational impact to organizations, but also bottom line in terms of the costs associated with not just paying a ransom, but also fixing the controls in place that allowed these attacks to be able to occur in the first place. So these attacks were obviously made possible due to a confluence of events. So obviously the rise in commoditized ransomware as a service, the change in the tools, techniques, and procedures, which includes not just encrypting business critical systems and data, but also expelling data as a part of a threat of a release as it relates to ransomware. The continual rise in cryptocurrency popularity, so the ability to be able to purchase goods and services. So my local convenience store actually has a Bitcoin ATM, and there are people out there purchasing cars and houses with cryptocurrency, and so obviously this is becoming more mainstream in terms of the ability to be able to access, purchase, and transfer cryptocurrency. But before we get too far in the presentation, I want to be able to make sure that we operationally define fraud, waste, and abuse. So obviously these are attacks that have obviously made it to the front page of the Washington Post. We can show kind of the Verizon DBIR in terms of the financial crimes that are on the rise. We've seen, statements over here in terms of inspector generals, in terms of, where a number of investigations are happening. But fraud is, again, as a definitional statement, the wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. Waste is defined as a thoughtless or careless expenditure, mismanagement, or abuse of resources to a detriment of the firm. And abuse is defined as excessive or improper use of a thing. So, or to use something in a manner contrary to the natural or legal use for that purpose. Finally, to bring it home. So where and how we work has changed rapidly and radically. And those changes and our dependency on technology and exposure to cyber threats has increased as well. And so obviously, as we look at the ability to be able to protect ourselves against fraud, waste, and abuse, we need to be able to look at where are the emerging trends in the industry to be able to address the heightened risk associated with these actors. So next slide, please. So who's perpetrating these actions? And so again, we want to be able to talk a little bit about the adversaries. We're not going to spend too much time here, but from a cyber threat actor perspective, cyber threat actors are not equal in terms of capability, sophistication. They have a range of resources, training, support for their activities. Cyber threat actors sometimes can operate on their own or as part of a large organization. So for example, sometimes nation states may work with organized crime groups. Sometimes even sophisticated actors may use less sophisticated tools and techniques because these are free or easily available, or makes them difficult for defenders to be able to attribute activity. So nation states are frequently the most sophisticated actors in threat groups, and so these have dedicated resources, personnel, and extensive planning and coordination. Some nation states have operational relationships with private sectors and other organized criminals. Cyber criminals are generally understood to have moderate sophistication in terms of in comparison to nation states. Nonetheless, they still have planning and support functions in addition to specialized technical capabilities that affect a large number of victims. And again, hacktivists, terrorist groups, and thrill seekers are typically at the lower end of the spectrum, and they have available tools that require a little technical skill to be able to deploy, but their actions are often not financially motivated, but again are primarily reputational impacts or try to be able to no long-lasting effects except for beyond reputation. So insider threats, again, at the bottom of the group, and so this over here is a important group for us to be able to talk about as part of the fraud, waste, and abuse. So insider threats are individuals working within an organization who are particularly dangerous because, again, they have access to internal networks that are protected at the security perimeters. Access is a key component for actors to be able to have access to privilege access, which eliminates the need to employ other remote means. So again, if they're already inside the new organization, then they don't need to be able to look for external methods and means to be able to infiltrate and exfiltrate information. So insider threats may be associated with other types, obviously. So there might be an insider threat that's also associated with a nation state, or insider threats also associated with organized crime, and so on and so forth. So, all right, next slide. So outside of some of the larger examples on the previous slide, so as we talked about kind of the large, front page of the Washington Post and New York Times attacks, as it relates to Colonial and JBS and Kia and NBA. So fraud, waste, and abuse can also be much more nuanced and persistent. It doesn't always need to be flashing lights. It doesn't always need to be klaxon sirens or encrypted hard drives asking for ransomware payments in Bitcoin within 72 hours. Sometimes fraud, waste, and abuse is small and incremental. So when looking at kind of a sampling distribution of transactions across web-facing applications, it's fairly easy to be able to write business logic to be able to identify potentially fraudulent activity. So for example, here are some common ones. The billing information is different than the contact information. So several small or unusually large transactions are made in a very short period of time. Or maybe maybe there's somebody who's trying to be able to buy something that's easily accessible within that particular location or country. So the common online fraud list that you see over here to the right-hand corner is indicative of examples that you might see which sit outside of the normal standard deviation of a transaction. So these activities do not necessarily mean that there is fraud happening. However, the risk is elevated, and the application may ask, potentially for step-up authentication to be able to ensure you are who you say you are. As an example, again, it's easier to be able to identify fraudulent transactions through a misplaced comma or a decimal point. So if the typical purchase is, say, $100, and then now there's a purchase for $10,000. So then obviously that falls outside of the realm of regular. But sometimes there are small and incremental changes, so which may not seem out of the ordinary. So maybe a routing number changes, or there's a modified email on a contact list, or maybe there's a new authorized user on the account. And so all normal under certain situations, and likely to be able to raise potential concerns. So with that being said, how can organizations continue to be able to minimize their attack surface while also providing more nuanced and robust notifications? Next slide. So consider the airport as a model for zero trust. I think we can all agree that there are fewer physical, high traffic locations that have a lower risk appetite than the airport. So an airport, there is little to no appetite for an event that to either happen on an airplane or within the terminal. And so obviously there's a lot of security and a lot of protective measures that go into place to be able to ensure that that passengers and the flight crew and the personnel who are moving through the concourse and the terminals are safe. So in the graphic to the left, it shows kind of the traditional passenger screening of the model in the airport. All passengers pass through the airport security checkpoint to access the boarding gates. In a zero trust terms, this is the policy decision point, policy enforcement point. So everyone must pass through this entry point. No one is trusted to be able to circumvent. Everybody goes through the gate. Everybody gets scanned. And so once through, the passengers and the airport employees and the aircraft crew can all mill about in the terminal area, and all the individuals are considered trusted. In this model, the implicit trust zone is the boarding area. So from a policy decision, policy enforcement perspective, this applies to a set of controls so that all traffic beyond this policy enforcement point has a common level of trust. So the policy decision, policy enforcement cannot apply to additional policies beyond the beyond the location of the flow of traffic. And so, for example, once you are authorized to be able to enter, so you are at this minimum level of security in terms of trust that you've been afforded through entering into this area. But to be able to allow the policy decision and enforcement point to be as specific as possible, it's important to be able to have the implicit trust zone be as small as possible. So this is one of the tenets, obviously, of zero trust. This brings us to the crux of what zero trust is. It's a security model. It's a set of design principles based upon an acknowledgement that threats exist both inside and outside of the traditional network boundaries. Zero trust repeatedly questions the premise that a user, device, network component should be implicitly trusted based upon their location in their network. It also embeds comprehensive security monitoring, granular, dynamic, risk-based access control, security automation, and also it is a data-centric security model that allows for the concept of least privilege to be applied for every access decision, where the answer to the question of who, what, when, where, and how are critically important, are critical for appropriately allowing for the denying of access to resources. So over the next few slides, we'll return to the airport metaphor and its relationship with zero trust. Next slide, please. This is also where we need to be able to make a qualification statement. Zero trust is not a silver bullet. It does not replace the need for proper cyber hygiene. You still need to patch, still need to rotate passwords, still need to assess risk, detect, deter, respond, and recover to events. So consider zero trust an enhancement on your existing security program where there are needs related to your organization's risk appetite. So this includes obviously coordinating an aggressive system monitoring, assuming that all requests for resources and all network traffic may be malicious, and assuming all devices and infrastructure may be compromised. Accepting that all access approvals to critical resources incur risk. So the following is a list of several zero trust concepts, which the next few slides will cover. And so we'll talk a little bit about fine-grained authentication, multi-factor authentication, enhanced monitoring. So again, we're going to because of the shortness of this talk, we're going to very specifically talk about user behavior analytics. Also because it applies very well into kind of the airport metaphor. We're going to talk a little about microsegmentation. Note there are other capabilities and other features that can be discussed here, but again, for the purposes of the time allowed, we can only really focus on a couple, and I felt that these were probably appropriate for the time frame that we had. Ultimately, the elements of zero trust enhancements can help address fraud, waste, and abuse by minimizing the attack surface and the blast radius associated with attacks, as well as providing deeper interrogation of activity to identify anomalies quicker and with greater accuracy. Next slide. So fine-grained authentication, fraud, waste, and abuse cases. So continuing again with the airport zero trust model. So upon the TSA arriving to the security gate, they will subject passengers to a number of inspections to ensure that they should be granted access to the terminal. So they'll look at user attributes. So the inspection typically includes the passenger presenting the boarding pass to the TSA agent, and we'll check to make sure that the name is the same that it appears on the driver's license. Object attributes. So does a passenger meet the minimum age for flying? Do they require assistance to move about the concourse? Do they look like the picture on their identification? So these are all object attributes. Action attributes. As the passenger passes through the security checkpoint, are there any qualified exceptions that this individual qualifies for? Are they a nursing mother and require to bring breast milk onto the airport, into the restricted area? Are they law enforcement and are authorized to be able to bring firearms into the airport? Does the individual require a service animal as a part of their transport that day, and to be able to bring authorized pets into airplanes? So again, these are all action attributes that are associated with these are all action attributes associated with what information is being done to the data by the subject, including reading, editing, approving, and deleting. And then finally, environmental attributes. So are you on a no-fly list? Is the ticket for the registered airline in the terminal, in that terminal, and for a flight that day? For example, are you presenting a ticket for a flight that is to take off that day, or was that flight 2 weeks ago, or yesterday, or tomorrow? And so we want to be able to make sure that the environmental attributes are appropriate to be able to gaining access into the terminal. So again, as we're looking across, again, user attributes, object attributes, action attributes, environmental attributes, and then we look at the policy, again, a set of rules stating for the permission of restriction to access that terminal. The TSA agent is the policy enforcement policy decision point to be able to enter into a terminal, and so the TSA agent will grant access based upon a predefined set of policies. And so that, for all intents and purposes, is really what policy-based or fine-grained authentication within within this context would mean. So, but similarly, authentication can be configured to be appropriately fine-grained and allow users access to a resource based upon predefined set of policies. To the left, we have the SolarWinds kind of a simplified attack. And so what I want to do is obviously bring this to something that was recent. And so so as we walk through again, as the attacker works their way through the organization. So again, there was supply chain attack, the execution of persistence, defense, invasion, recon, initial command and control, and exfiltration. So as we move down to hands-on keyboard attacks, so once the attacker gained access to the network with the compromised credentials, they attempted to be able to move laterally using multiple different credentials. The credentials used for lateral movement were always different, and from those they also use also different from the ones they use from remote access. So since a valid but unauthorized security token and account were utilized, detecting this activity would require again a maturity in monitoring to identify actions that were outside of a user's normal duties. For example, it was unlikely that an account associated with somebody in HR would need to be able to have access to cyber threat intelligence database. So from a fine-grained authorization perspective, limiting access to control rights to least privilege would have potentially mitigated some of the efforts in terms of lateral movements, as well as provided an avenue to identify anomalous activity for example, a single machine attempting to be able to authenticate with multiple credentials that were outside of the realm of normal. So again, the fine-grained authentication wouldn't have obviously prevented the SolarWinds attack, but it would significantly have reduced the attack surface again if policy-based authentication were in place with the credentials that the attacker would have had access to. So moving on. Next slide, please. So as we continue with the airport metaphor, when a passenger approaches various checkpoints in the airport, they're asked to be able to provide identification. So provide and your plane ticket. So something you have and something you are. This works as kind of the initial security checkpoint, but to get into the terminal, but also through customs, through the frequent flyer suite, through the boarding gates, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes you might be asked for different types of credentials to pass through certain areas. So for example, if you're an airport worker, you may be asked to be able to provide a PIN code for a door or a separate badge to be able to get into different restricted areas. So again, MFA is something that you have and something you are. So attackers may be using phishing, social engineering, or a combination of attacks to be able to obtain credentials of a valuable account. This is something you are. However, if that attacker is unable to be able to get access to something you have, like for example a token, they will be unable to be able to proceed further. So what's also important to be able to note here is, and I call it out here in the slide, is that it's important from an organizational perspective to be able to understand what you consider valuable. And so for that, what your definition of valuable may be very different what an attacker's motivation may be interested in. So for an example, an administrative account may be valuable to you as an organization, but attacker may be also very interested in financial gain and maybe consider accounts that have access to financial or payment resources of equal or maybe even greater value. So as you're looking to be able to apply multi-factor authentication to applications, look across not just what you consider normal as part of privileged access, but also where value may also lie within the attackers or the adversaries that you're looking to be able to defend against. Again, trying to bring this back over to things that have happened within the recent topic. So Colonial Pipeline. So again, this was front page news here in the United States and the East Coast. Colonial Pipeline was hit with a ransomware attack. And so this ransomware attack obviously ultimately disrupted the gasoline supply in parts of the Southeast and lasted about a month. With attackers able to get a password to an old VPN account. So this particular legacy VPN only had single factor authentication, and it was a complicated password. It was not, password 1 2 3 4 type of password. It was complex, but it's important to be able to note that even complex passwords are vulnerable to cracking and to discovery with enough time and effort. So if this VPN was protected with multi-factor authentication, it would have thwarted the attackers as part of access into this particular attack method. Cool. Right, next slide. All right. Continuing again with the airport metaphor. So once passengers are in the terminal, there is no expectation of privacy. There is a prescribed path between the terminal and the gate, and is what we would consider kind of regular traffic. So you go into the gate, then you go into the terminal, and then you're proceeding through the terminal over to your boarding gate. You get on the airplane, and then you depart over in your destination. During this time, we're expected to be able to act within personas. So passengers, airport crew members, shop workers, security all follow a predefined user behavior. And so when users from a certain profile deviates, this requires obviously further investigation. For example, it would be suspicious if a crew member used their badge to be able to access a boarding gate at the same time that they are in transit on another flight. And so this would be obviously a case of impossible travel that user behavior analytics would be able to identify. So you can't be in two places at the same time. But what's important, and I know that this graphic is fairly small, but I'll try to walk people through it. Everything starts with data. So from time reporting to emails, to phone records, to file downloads are all data. So from data, we move to observations. So again, we're looking at file size, we're looking at timing, we're looking at the login attempts, so on and so forth. And so these are all observations. And so once we have obviously raw data and we move from observations, we move to indicators. So indicators are really, is there a policy violation? Is there an attempt to be able to access information that's outside of your need to know or your privileged access? And so again, from indicators, we move to be able to assign personas. So again, something can be completely normal. Again, kind of going back over to the airport metaphor, the passenger will go through the gate and they'll go through the terminal, but they likely won't try to be able to access a restricted environment or a restricted area or a place that's outside of their need to know or their right to be able to access. So and similarly, you wouldn't see airport crew who work on the ground trying to be able to access an airplane to be able to board and sit into a seat like a passenger would. So again, you're assigned personas both in an airport, but also within an environment as well. So as one of the important things I also wanted to be able to touch on here is really some additional context. It's important to be able to consider singular versus contextual assessment. So a singular threat assessment would requires us to be able to treat each request individually and does not take into consideration the subject history and consideration when making evaluations. So this can allow for obviously faster evaluations, but there is a risk that the attack can go undetected if it stays within that subject's defined role. So for example, if an attacker steals HR credentials and then only tries to be able to attempt to access HR records, then obviously that falls within kind of defined persona in terms of what that credential is able to be able to access, and wouldn't seem abnormal as part of the singular assessment. So more difficult and is kind of the contextual assessment. So that takes into not just kind of the subject's persona, but also the agent's recent, or the individual's recent history into consideration when evaluating access requests. So this means that the policy enforcement, going back over to the policy enforcement policy decision point. So the policy enforcement point must maintain some sort of state information on the on all subjects that try to be able to access that resource, and but maybe more likely to, so from this perspective, maybe more likely to be able to detect an attacker in a pattern that is atypical of what the policy enforcement sees for a given subject. So the analysis of the subject behavior can be used to be able to provide a model of acceptable use, deviations from that behavior that could trigger additional authentication checks, and also step up, and also maybe even potentially denial of those resources as well. So, next slide, please. So finally, rounding out the airport metaphor, so passengers are screened and authorized to be able to proceed into the terminal. However, just as with multi-factor authentication, there are secure enclaves within an airport. So again, there are multiple terminals, and so sometimes you're asked to be able to re-authenticate as you move into different terminals. There are departure gates where you need to be able to provide, obviously, additional information prior to boarding the airplane. Customs, if you're traveling international, and there are additional screenings as you're moving into the international concourse, or if you're deplaning from an international location. Frequent flyer lounges also are locations where you require additional information to be able to access. And so all these different policies relates to gaining access. So zero trust can be implemented based upon placing individuals or groups of resources on a unique network segment protected by a gateway security component. And so again, we're going to talk a little bit about here to the graphic to the left here in a minute. So infrastructure devices such as routers, next generation firewalls, so special purpose gateway devices to act as kind of policy enforcement points, protecting each other, protecting each resource in a small group or related resource. Host-based micro-segmentation using software agents or firewalls on endpoint assets as well. But it's important to be able to note that in order for micro-segmentation to be successful, an identity governance program must be sufficiently mature, since the gateway components will rely on these attributes to act as a policy enforcement point. So in a diagram to the right, we have web applications and databases are segmented with load balancers and with distributed firewalls at the perimeter of the microsegment. So each of the microsegments leverages a distributed firewall as a policy enforcement point, with prescribed policies allowing for only authorized traffic in and out of those segments. This significantly limits the attack surface for an adversary by making lateral movement very difficult, and allowing for security monitoring teams to be able to identify anomalous activities that would be considered out of the normal very, very quickly. All right, next slide, please. So closing thoughts. Again, we went pretty quickly here, and so I want to be able to allow for some time to be able to have some Q&A. So applications within zero trust principle obviously require organizational commitment. This is kind of a no-brainer. So when you're looking at zero trust, it does require significant top-down support, because again, you may be changing the ways in which the organization is looking to be able to address security. Again, it goes from what would you consider adequate security for an application or a system or a data element, and changing that paradigm to be able to move it over and saying, how much risk am I willing to be able to accept as a part of engaging within this model? So that obviously is top-down, board level kind of risk appetite conversations to be able to say, how do we apply these in a case-by-case basis. Employing zero trust still requires a risk-based approach. How much risk is your organization willing to be able to accept? So at the end of the day, the cure can't be worse than the disease. Zero trust changes the paradigm. Again, instead of asking for how much security is considered adequate, it asks how much risk am I willing to be able to accept. Uh, 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 it is a risk-based approach, and as the saying goes, the most secure computer is the one that is turned off, that is unplugged, that is in a safe, that is under under a lake, and guarded by sharks. And even then, there might be some question about how safe that computer really is, as kind of a famous saying goes. So knowing that 100% safe isn't where you're looking to be able to address. And so as you're creeping up from zero, are you willing to be able to accept 10, 20, 30, 40? Where is your risk appetite as a part of that transition? So because you still need to be able to have those workstations and those applications to be able to be usable. And so how can you? And so that brings to the question is that how do you gain buy-in versus making security an even longer process and harder. So implementing zero trust doesn't mean no more automated updates, or it doesn't mean making the third party risk Q&A that goes out even longer. It does need to be a business-centric approach with everybody going to the table to be able to say what is appropriate in certain cases, and it's okay for you to be able to change, obviously, what the definition of the amount of risk that you're willing to be able to accept within appetite. Obviously, there needs to be a close partnership between the cybersecurity and the fraud department. So from a monitoring side, everything starts with data. So we talked about that as part of the user behavior analytics. And so as we move from data, we move to observations. And so observations over to indicators. And so indicators we assign personas. So, but again, as from the fraud department, they're a consumer of this data and can also help to be able to manage and lead investigations on their side. And so from a cybersecurity perspective, there may be access to data on the IT side or on the information security side that could also be help to be able to calibrate the specific business cases that the fraud department is looking to be able to implement. So there also needs to be monitoring. We're not just talking about humans here. We're also talking about machine accounts. We're also talking about machine-to-machine communications. And so it's important to be able to say, it's not just kind of the user accounts that we're looking at. We need to be able to look at the entirety of the access requests that are happening within the organization, as even if it's a print server talking to another machine in a different VPC or VLAN that may also be considered not normal. And so we need to look at all of the accounts and all the activity as part of that as well. One of the things that I've also been thinking a lot about recently too is about third parties, so including SaaS providers. So the shared responsibility model as it relates to third party, how does this equate to zero trust? Obviously, from a shared responsibility model, there is some level of risk transference that happens when you move to software, platform, infrastructure, or managed services as a service. So, not to say that is antithetical from a zero trust perspective, but you need to be able to have that open and honest conversation to say, okay, if we're going to go with a managed service, how is that going to affect our risk posture, risk appetite as it relates to our presence with as it relates to zero trust. And so finally, and I think this is kind of the good news here. So most firms are already doing some of this. So again, most firms are already doing elements of zero trust in some way, shape, or form. It's really about taking the conversation and again saying how much risk am I willing to be able to accept versus versus what is considered adequate security. Most organizations already have MFA, and most organizations are already doing some level of segmentation within organizations. Most organizations are already looking at, again, if it's not fine-grained, it's rough-grained authentication, looking at role-based authentication. And so it's really looking at how can you take certain blocks, blocking and tackling, and tighten down certain areas and sufficiently to be able to address work in these areas. So with that, thank you. I appreciate that brings me to the end of my conversation. Next slide. So these are some references again, as you're looking at kind of where this information came from or was gleaned from. Again, so this is kind of where some of that resources and contextual information on the following slides. So fine. So thank you. Q&A.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for such an insightful and informative session, and that was really very interesting. So before we begin with the Q&A, we will be starting a short poll. So let us know if you are interested to learn more about our programs and take part in the poll. Should we start with the Q&A, John?
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. The first question we have is how to ensure that there is no weak link within employees from where there can be a threat.
So one more time, can you repeat that?
How to ensure that there is no weak link within employees from where there can be a threat.
So I'm going to try to repeat. So how to be able to ensure that there is no weak link within compliance, so that you don't have a threat. So I think that from continuous assessment, continuous improvement, testing, obviously, we talk a little bit about at the front of the conversation about the 3 lines of defense. And so obviously you've got first line, second line, and third line. So IT controls, enterprise risk management, and audit. And so these are all kind of the necessary checks and balances associated with making sure that there is a robustness associated with the information security controls, but to be able to identify where those weak links might be. But again, that's only part of the puzzle. And so again, that's reacting to obviously a deficiency that's already within the environment. And so that's important to be able to couple obviously with the target state, so the maturity. So where are you driving an organization from a control perspective? How do you continue to be able to implement new and existing enhancing controls that's consonant with the risk posture associated with the organization, but also knowing that innovation is going to continue to happen within your organization. So as I like to say, innovation is inversely proportional to security. So the more innovation that you have, that security needs to be brought along with that, and not bolted on at the end. And so needs to have conversations at the same table to be able to say, okay, well, if we're going to go into a multi-cloud environment, or if we're going to move into mesh networks or containerized applications, how is this going to change our risk appetite, and how do we need to be able to tighten down certain controls in certain areas so that we don't inadvertently add weak links to our security posture through addressing the innovation on the other side. Good question.
Thank you, John. The next question is there any way you could quantitatively describe waste in terms of annual cost of safeguards, ACS, or say in terms of annualized loss expectancy, etc.?
Oh, that's so there are some quantitative measures for assessing assessing risk. And so obviously I think that the most prevalent one is FAIR, and I can't remember exactly what FAIR stands. FAIR is a framework for assessing risk as a part of a organization. One of the things that I would also encourage people to look at is how to be able to assess your technical debt within an organization too. And so technical debt can also be an indicator of weakening controls in certain areas. So again, kind of the basics of cyber hygiene is, patch and rotate passwords and ensure that you're operating at the most recent or patched operating system within an organization. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit. So, but FAIR is, I think, the one that kind of comes to mind first and foremost.
Okay, the next question we have is how to ensure zero trust when top level management is involved.
That's so. I think that uh, when top level management is involved from a zero trust perspective, I think it's important to be able to, again, take it to the risk appetite. So say what what is the level of risk that we're willing to be able to accept here? So what is the amount of fraud that we're willing to be able to accept? So what is the amount of financial loss, external financial loss or internal financial loss that we're willing to be able to accept as part of that? And then lead top level management through kind of those conversations to be able to say, okay, well, we're not willing to be able to accept any financial loss. Okay, well then that's your starting point in terms of designing the information security or the zero trust policies behind that. So, but maybe there's a situation where you can where top level management is saying we are willing to be able to accept some financial loss externally facing because we don't want to interrupt or impact our customers unduly, but we don't want to face reputational impact, and we don't want to be able to face regulatory or governance sanctions as it relates to a breach and so on and so forth. And so that, again, that you can design your security risk posture based upon those appetite definitional statements. And so in some cases, again, it might also be the risk appetite internally might be a little bit more stringent, because again, if you're already inside the organization, if you're already, again, kind of going back over to the insider threat, there might be certain situations where you're designing controls that are more stringent to be able to capture or catch those aspects quicker in a more thoughtful and concerted area. Good question.
The next question is, can zero trust be implemented in each and every institution? If yes, what are the key requirements needed to implement the zero trust?
So the answer is yes. So I think that it was kind of that last bullet in the last slide that I had, is that I think that many organizations currently already have elements of zero trust within their organization. Again, and it's let's start with MFA. So most organizations already have multi-factor authentication within their organization. Most organizations don't already have segmented networks that so they'll have their data plane, their application plane, their security data plane. So there's already certain segments that have already kind of existed within organizations, and I think that obviously there's already monitoring in a lot of cases. I think that it's taking kind of that basis and doing an assessment and saying, okay, where is my organization at currently as it relates to some of these zero trust components, again, and flipping the conversation, saying, okay, let's move away from what is adequate security versus how much risk I'm willing to be able to accept in the event of a compromise, in the event of a breach, in the event of impact to confidentiality, availability, and integrity. How much risk am I willing to be able to accept? And then to be able to build on those existing security controls to be able to say, okay, in these situations, we're going to accept less risk than in some of these other applications or these other systems. Good question.
Thank you, John. The next question is how to balance zero trust with business operations.
I think that obviously from a zero trust perspective and within business operations, I think it goes hand in hand. Again, it does require significant engagement with the business. It does require conversations so that, again, kind of going back over to the last slide again, is that the cure can't be worse than the disease. So what are we trying to be able to solve for? But at the end of the day, the most secure computer, again, is the one that's unplugged and turned off and in the bottom of a lake. So we need to be able to say, what that level of risk that we're willing to be able to accept as part of those specific use cases, as part of the fundamental strategy in terms of protecting our business. And business has to be at the table in order to be able to help us define and qualify that risk appetite. Because as security professionals, we can help to be able to implement those controls and those technologies and those tools and those processes, but it needs to be articulated again from the business side of things to be able to say where are they willing to be able to loosen up, and where are they not willing to be able to accept any risk at all. So.
Thank you, John.
And it's okay for you to be able to change. Yeah, it's okay to be able to go back iteratively over to the table, either on an annual or biannual or semi-annual basis, to be able to say, has things within the market, has things within our understanding of their industry in terms of adversaries, to be able to tighten down certain areas, to be able to address emerging risks. Again, I don't think that 2 years ago, obviously ransomware was an issue, but it is not as big of an issue as it is today. So, good question.
Yeah, we'll take one last question. How do you apply zero trust to a workstation where the user is a local admin on the device?
How do you apply zero trust on? So obviously there would need to be two sets of credentials. So the regular, again, I think there are, not to get too deep into the weeds, there are ways to be able to obviously segment the identity access management components, to be able to ensure segregation of duties, and allow for the user to be able to operate with a certain level of credentials at one level, and then obviously a privileged access at a certain predefined period of point in time. So obviously that individual shouldn't always log in with their privileged access, if the duties that they're performing do not necessitate obviously that elevated privilege. But again, that all goes back into, again, policies and procedures side of things, to be able to say there is the technical ability to be able to segment out those access rights in a meaningful and thoughtful way. But again, it needs to include both people, process, and technology, as well as governance, to be able to ensure that people are doing the right things at the right times, and also training as well. So, good question.
Thank you, John. We got one more question. We'll take this one more question and then we'll end the session. This question is how to foresee zero trust approach in ICS, Industrial Computer Systems.
Okay. So I think that's getting a little bit outside of my frame of reference, but I'm gonna attempt to be able to answer. So from an industrial control systems perspective, obviously the risk appetite is going to be fairly low, and typically ICS will operate in kind of a separate or segmented network that is hopefully separate from the IT part. Now, obviously, as you're looking at kind of the OSI model, so levels 1 through 7, you're looking at the Purdue model, which is really kind of based upon operational technology. There is the interface between the IT and the OT at really kind of the HMI level, and so we need to be able to make sure that we're being very thoughtful and very conscientious in how we're connecting IT to OT, making sure that there is resiliency, making sure that obviously the interrogation, making sure that, again, all those things that are appropriate in terms of authentication, fine-grained monitoring, as well as appropriate network segmentation, to be able to keep the operational technology into its appropriate segment, potentially, hopefully a micro segment versus network, by and large, network connectivity through the entire IT organization. So, but good question. I think that's one of the things that we're also very keen to be able to understand, obviously, after the Colonial Pipeline breach that happened as well. So, excellent questions.
Thank you, John. So now we have come to the Q&A session, and thank you so much for answering those questions and for such a great presentation, John. It was a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure as well.
And thank you to all the attendees who have joined the webinar and took part in the poll. And with this, we'll end the session. So you may now disconnect your lines. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you once again.